I can still remember buying this book, this exact copy, as a kid. I don't remember my precise age or the year, but I do remember standing in Walden Books, staring at the cover, enchanted. Before I saw this book, I had read things like Encyclopedia Brown, The Boxcar Children, Super Fudge. And these are all good books, to be sure, but they're all very much grounded in reality. I was entranced by this strange book with the sword wielding mouse on the cover. The characters in books that I had read before, they all existed in a world that was recognizably similar to the one I lived in. Here, though, was a brand new world, strange, different. Reading this book opened my eyes to the possibilities of fantasy fiction. But how does it hold up in 2023? Amid the other things that I read last year, I read the first 5 books of the Redwall series. Redwall, Mossflower, Madameo, Mariel of Redwall, and Salamandastron. Although Martin the Warrior was the first one that I had read when I was a kid, it's actually the 6th in publication order. But it's the first one that I finished this year in 2023. I didn't remember any of the plot points from the first time I had read it as a child, and I have some thoughts. So here's one thing I liked about Martin the Warrior, and one thing I didn't like. Mild spoilers ahead for a 30-year-old book. This really goes, as far as I know, for the entire Redwall series. But perhaps my favorite thing about this book is that it exists in a world without moral shades of gray. There's been a trend in recent years, and I won't name names as to who I think is largely responsible for this, for stories to feature heroes who have a dark side, villains who have a light side. Now, to be fair to this trend, characters with moral shades of gray are more realistic than pure goodness or pure villainy. But while this nihilistic view might be more realistic, it is ultimately damaging to the soul to not have idealistic examples to strive for. This trend toward moral shades of gray has become so prevalent that even established heroes have been corrupted, turned into bitter, angry, flawed versions of themselves. It feels vaguely vicious, this trend. Look at your heroes, modern storytellers seem to say. Look at them. They're no better than you. Martin the Warrior, by contrast, does not feature these moral shades of gray. Characters may make individual choices, pacifism versus paladin, for instance. But characters who are good are truly good, to the core, and they don't ever betray that expectation. I cannot express how important that is. To know that you can put your trust in an author, to relax into a book, knowing that the author won't take your favorite hero and turn them into a dark, vindictive version of themselves. It did not take me very long while reading this book to notice this, simply because the mythos of this current era has conditioned me to expect those moral shades of gray. I kept expecting good characters to be vicious, petty, cruel, and when it didn't happen, it kept surprising me. I'll give you a couple of examples. At the start of the book, Martin has been enslaved by a sea rat turned warlord named Badrang, but Martin's warrior spirit will not allow him to tolerate the indignity of slavery, so he rebels. His acts of defiance do ultimately lead to his escape, but they also make life considerably harder for the rest of Badrang's slaves. My unconscious expectation was for the slaves to turn on Martin, to exhibit cowardice, selfishness. So I was surprised when the opposite occurred, when the slaves were inspired by his actions and they rallied to his cause. There was one notable exception to this among the slaves, Droop the bank vole, but it turns out he was already fundamentally evil, a spy for one of Badrang's lieutenants. Likewise, when Feldo and Brome, two slaves who escaped with Martin, encounter the rambling Rosehip players, a ragtag group of traveling actors, my unconscious expectation was for the actors to not help the slaves, unless there was something in it for them. I was expecting the rambling Rosehip players to be mercenary in their behavior, when in fact they turned out to be brave and selfless, putting themselves at considerable risk to help free the slaves, for no other reason than it's the right thing to do. It was at this point in the story that I really noticed, how the book kept subverting my expectations. I say subverting, but that's not really an accurate term, though, is it? It's modern storytelling that subverts, that sets up the expectation of this is a hero, this is a good guy, and then destroys that expectation. Martin the Warrior doesn't do that. You can't really call it subverting when a story depicts someone as a hero and then they consistently behave heroically. Martin the Warrior shows us characters who are good, shows us what that goodness looks like, shows us how these characters choose to do good even when it's costly. And Martin the Warrior does it without ever moralizing or preaching. That's my absolute favorite thing about this book. Here's something I didn't like about this book in the Redwall series. There's almost no Redwall in it. Throughout the Redwall series, Brian Jacques frequently uses framing devices. Books will open in Redwall Abbey with one or more characters telling a story to one or more other characters. And then the bulk of the book will be that story, and then the book will wrap up back in the present day in Redwall Abbey with the character or characters wrapping up their story. By and large, this works. But in this book, the framing device is literally the only place where we see Redwall Abbey. My initial thought while reading this was that since this was only the 6th book in the series, perhaps Brian Jacques hasn't quite established yet that Redwall was the series' focus. But nope, then I looked at the cover and right there it says A Novel of Redwall. Of course, I know that another book before this one had a similar approach. The book Mossflower takes place before Redwall Abbey is even built. But here's the difference. Mossflower contains many of the things that make a Redwall book recognizable, while Martin the Warrior, it just doesn't. Mossflower takes place in recognizable parts of the Redwall world, while in Martin the Warrior, outside of the framing device, I don't believe there's any part of it that was referenced in previous material. The geography is all different. For all intents and purposes, it's an entirely different world from the 5 books before it. Some other things that the Mossflower book contains that Martin the Warrior doesn't. Puzzles and riddles as a plot device. The mountain Salamandastron and its Badger Lord. Log-a-log. Truly epic battles. Martin the Warrior curiously removes all these elements that were present, for the most part, in the previous books, and I feel as a result that the book suffers for it. It feels only tenuously connected to the established Redwall world as a result. we need heroes. We need heroes that are wholly good, that give us something to aspire to. We need stories showing these heroes acting selflessly, showing them being brave, showing them making hard, morally consistent choices. We need this because so often in our real world, we fall short of that mark. It is damaging to the spirit to only see heroes fall, to only see heroes becoming corrupted. I was personally shocked at how deeply this modern notion of nihilism had seeped into my own psyche. It causes cynicism. It takes away our sense of nobility. And ultimately, it allows us to justify our own failings. If our heroes can't be good, how do we have any hope? Martin the Warrior, then, acts as a vital and necessary cure to this disease of nihilism. Characters in this book are good, yes, even impossibly good. And that's important because it reminds us of how we ought to be. In that way, Martin the Warrior is a balm for the spirit, a soothing refuge in the midst of modernity's insistence on amorality. There can be no better takeaway from this book than the statement of Abbot Saxtus at the very end of it. Our abbey is a place of friendship. Anyone, young or old, who has read or heard of Redwall may come and visit us. If you are honest and of good heart, no matter what the season, our door is open to you. Whether for the first time or for the return of an old companion, you are welcome. Please feel free to visit us anytime you pass by this way.